this is a text exchange between you and Minister David Lametti. Just scroll down a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk. I'm not sure what you're referring to. You say, you were perfect today. Thanks. So were you, buddy. Then should I? So the blue is Minister.
Little collegial support at a very stressful time.
Slash bromance. Okay.
I think he might resent that suggestion.
So were you, buddy. Should I call Downey? You've spoken to Sylvia. Downey, there would be a reference to Doug Downey?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you tell us who, just for the record, can you tell us who Doug Downey is and why Minister Lametti might be calling him?
He's the Attorney General of Ontario. He's Minister Lametti's provincial counterpart.
Okay. And so you have spoken to Sylvia, he says, and you say, I have spoken with Sylvia. You should call Downey. We need them in the right space to respond to any RFA for OPP assistance. And then Minister Lametti replies, spoke to Doug Downey, needs slowly to be quick, quick, quick. Can you tell us why would Minister Lametti be calling Doug Downey about this? So you're speaking to your counterpart, he's speaking to his. And what capacity would that be?
Well, again, I mean, you're asking me to interpret or infer why Minister Lametti has reached out to Doug Downey. The best answer that I can offer is I believe he is reaching out to a provincial counterpart to understand what Ontario's response is to the situation, not only in Ottawa, but elsewhere, including in Windsor at the Ambassador Bridge. And by then, the blockade was causing significant interruption to the economy. Again, thousands of people were temporarily laid off. Businesses were impacted in the auto manufacturing sector. So I think he's trying to gain some understanding from the Attorney General of Ontario about perhaps what advice he is offering to the Ontario government. Again, I'm drawing some inferences here, but I think it's a combination of that. But I think more broadly, just to keep lines of communication strong between the federal government and the government of Ontario.
Okay, so you actually asked him to call Downey. So do you have a recollection of why, or is it essentially what you just told us?
Yeah, no, actually, there it is right there. Yes, so I would say that was my thinking at the time, was to try and keep lines of communication open and to be sure that that we had some understanding about, you know, what advice may be provided to the Ontario government.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Clerk, next document is ONT 401141. So I understand that there was a call that took place between you and Minister Jones on the 7th. And in that earlier text exchange, you seem to refer to an earlier call before the 5th. I don't know if do you have any recollection of that one?
I'm sorry, which document am I looking at here?
Andy England, I'm counsel for the Government of Alberta.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to just take you back to something that you said earlier in response to a question from Commission Counsel. I believe you said that Premier Kenney expressed to you that he had neither the resources nor the tools to deal with the blockades in Alberta. And I just wanted to clarify what you meant by tools. Often in this inquiry, that term has been used to refer to legislative tools or authorities, such as, you know, being able to use the criminal code. And so I was hoping you could clarify what you meant by using that word.
Yeah, that's a fair question. What I was referring to were conversations that we had at the beginning of February, where he had indicated that he needed physical tools and assets to help clear the blockade. I believe he was expressing a concern that he was having a really hard time getting access to those assets through either the RCMP or through provincial police services. So he was putting to me the suggestion that we might be able to assist him through military assets. And I'd said to him that although statutorily requests for assistance were still within my office's authorities, that they were in practice being addressed by my colleague, Minister Blair, in the new ministry that was created following the 21 election through the Ministry of Emergency Preparedness. And I took that conversation and I committed to then Premier Kenney that I would relay it to both Ministers Anand and Blair.
Okay, thank you. So you meant physical tools as opposed to legislative authority?
At that point, yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. If I could I please take you to document ssm.nsc.can 403069?
inspection by the Ottawa Police Board. So I'm afraid I can't give you more details about who put this together, but this is in evidence before the committee.
This is a City of Ottawa publication, is what you're saying.
It might be. It's something that was put into evidence by the Ottawa Police Board. I can't speak to them, sir, about how they generated it.
Okay, I don't recognize this document.
Okay. Well, then look, let's soldier on. So if you look under regular members, federal RCMP, yes, Mr. Registrar, thank you. It sort of says at the end of this line that 167 officers were deployed. And so that, I mean, were you aware of that figure on that day?
Well, setting aside the exact time frame, I am familiar with the initial figure of about 150 in that range. And again, you've heard previously that there was some ongoing back and forth on exactly how many and when, but that was one figure that had came to me early on in that range.
In that range. And so, I mean, you'd agree that on its face, it does appear that these numbers are lower than the 250 that are in the agreement I showed you.
Well, I agree that on the face of this document that is lower than 250, but again, without knowing more about the authorship or the origins of this document, it is very difficult for me to testify as to its accuracy.
And you're not able to say, and I think I know the answer, sir, but I have to do it for the record. You're not able to say of that 167, how many were at Rideau Cottage and on the Parliamentary Precinct?
I am not.
Okay. Minister, I'd like to just turn to another theme if I could. And so this morning you made a number of statements. You said it was virtually impossible to enforce the law in Wellington. Wellington falls within the jurisdiction of the OPS. The RCMP could not go and assert itself in Wellington to bring things under control. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And so, Minister, were you able to, I know you're very busy, but were you able to review or be briefed on Commissioner Lookey's cross-examination last week?
I don't know that I was briefed. I may have read some general reports about it in the media.
So my co-counsel went through some issues in respect of those themes with Commissioner Lookey, and I just want to take you to what she said, if you wouldn't mind. And so this is transcript 23, Mr. Registrar, and we're on to we're going to begin at page 241. And Mr. Mendocino, I know you're a member of the Law Society of Ontario, so this will be there'll be a bit of legal questioning here.
Okay.
Great. So if you can start at line 5, super. Okay. So my colleague, Ms. Shanmuganathan, was asking questions of Commissioner Lookey. So I just want to take you through some of the back and forth, if I could. So my colleague says, my co-counsel, okay, so you'll agree that the RCMP officers have the power to enforce the criminal code, for instance, and the commissioner says yes. Then my co-counsel says, right, and they always have the power to enforce the code. It's just part of what they're allowed to do, and the commissioner says yes. And then if you could scroll down, Mr. Registrar, my co-counsel says, right, they don't need to be sort of the local police in a jurisdiction. This is a power they always have. And the commissioner says yes. And then my colleague says, right, and there's nothing in the code, for example, that says an RCMP officer can't enforce the criminal code in one particular place. They can enforce that anywhere in Canada. And the Commissioner Lookey is not sure. And I'll let you read her response there, sir. And when you're done, let us know and I'll go to the next page. And Commissioner, I know I'm a little bit over time, but I think this is an important point. It goes to the jurisdiction on Wellington.
It appears that it's your understanding on February 9th at 7:35 p.m. that Chief Mizuno had not requested any additional police officers from the OPP. Was that your understanding? And if so, where did you attain that understanding?
This exchange is about trying to clear up what I think is a miscommunication or a misunderstanding between different levels of enforcement and the city of Windsor. And so what I'm really trying to get to the bottom of there is whether or not additional help had been turned down by the city of Windsor.
But it says apparently your police chief just told. So the question is, where did you ascertain that belief or that understanding?
I am trying to recall whether or not that was information that I got either directly from Commissioner Lucky or from other sources. Off the top of my head, I can't say.
Okay, and lastly, just on page 20 here, last question here, Mr. Commissioner. So on February 14th at 11:57 a.m. says that to the extent you, so here being Mr. Dilkens, you can be supportive of any additional authorities that gets Windsor the resources you need to keep the bridge open, people safe, that would be great. Is it your understanding that Mayor Drew Dilkens invoked the citywide emergency before or after this text message?
Off the top of my head, can't recall. But I know first that the Ontario government had declared a state of emergency on the Friday before, which would have been, I'm just doing.
So I think on the 14th, the
Yeah.
city of Windsor declared an emergency by order of
Same
the mayor,
day.
correct?
Yeah, that
So-
sounds about right. But
Don't recall.
But yeah, the Ontario government had declared the Friday before.
Okay, and last one here, where you reference resources. Do these resources include money?
He and I and other representatives of the government have had a conversation around potential compensation for losses suffered to businesses and residents arising out of the blockade. Yes.
Understood, okay. And I'm out of time, so thank you for the indulgence. Those are my questions.
Email, I thought he put in a rather concise way his view, his opinion as to the roles of different orders of government.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. You can take that one down now. So one thing we spent a lot of time talking about this morning with Minister Mendicino, so we won't spend a ton of time on it this afternoon or evening, but is engagement with Ontario and specifically and Ontario's role in responding to these events. So as I said, the Commission has heard a lot of evidence about Ontario's role over the past 5 weeks and attempts to essentially draw Ontario into the conversation, into tripartite meetings, into being part of the solution. And it seems that, I'll just try and summarize this, Ontario's position at first may have been, as you sort of just articulated, well, this is it's Parliament. It's a federal vaccine mandate and it's happening at Parliament, so this is really a federal problem. Is that a fair characterization, do you think, of what Ontario's initial attitude was?
I'm not sure. I can't speak for the government of Ontario or what Premier Ford or his ministers were thinking. But as I said, in the initial arrival of the convoy in Ottawa, the focus was on the nation's capital. As we know, it quickly spread to other cities and other parts of the country, not just in the province of Ontario. But we did as a national government, and my colleagues, I know the Transport Minister, Mr. Mendicino himself, and senior officials of our government, deputy ministers, were engaging in active and ongoing discussions with their Ontario counterparts as the situation in Ottawa was becoming more entrenched to see if every possible provincial regulatory or legislative authority was being brought to bear to try and resolve ultimately not only Ottawa, of course, but Windsor and other places. So I think our government, and I remember those conversations from the Incident Response Group meetings or the Cabinet Security and Safety Committee, there was an ongoing and active effort, both at the level of ministers, but senior officials supporting them, to reach out to provincial jurisdictions where they were seeing some of the sort of sympathy or knock-on effects of the Ottawa occupation to make sure that every available authority was being brought to bear to bring these illegal events to a conclusion.
And I suppose the response that the federal government would have gotten would be varying degrees of success, if we can put it that way.
Yeah, I think that, and obviously the inability across the country to use existing provincial and municipal authorities was one of the constant discussions before our government as we led up to the ultimate decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. But I remember from the very beginning an effort to educate ourselves as a government, and Mr. Goodale's email to some extent speaks to that, in terms of the different jurisdictional roles of orders of government. But we quickly understood the importance of collaborating and ensuring that municipal and provincial authorities were very much working with federal agencies that could provide support. And there are a number of federal agencies that were working with their counterparts, of course, but to really use every available remedy to bring these very damaging illegal occupations or blockades to an end.
Okay. And we know that on February 10th, you had a call with Premier Ford. Can you tell us about that call, how it came about? And before you even start, I'll pull up the document for your benefit. There's a readout of it at ssm.nsc.can 50256. So just situating in time, this would be the Ambassador Bridge blockade is in full swing. February 10th is the date of the first IRG, so we're fairly advanced in the events of the time period we're looking at. And scroll down, is that the right document? Okay, yeah, there we go. Readout of Minister LeBlanc's call with Doug Ford tonight. Okay, so what can you tell us about the call that you had with Premier Ford?
So it was on the evening of February 10th. I remember, as you said, it was following that incident response group meeting. I left Ottawa to fly home to Moncton, New Brunswick, and I had been asked to talk to Premier Ford specifically around what we thought were some authorities the province had in the transportation sector around trucking licenses, permits, insurance certificates. I'm certainly not an expert on the precise regulatory authorities around provincial transportation sectors, but there was a belief that the province of Ontario may have a series of instruments or authorities that perhaps hadn't been brought to bear, whether it was in Windsor or in Ottawa. So it was suggested that I could perhaps reach out to Premier Ford. I have a very constructive and cordial relationship with financial measures. I do know that that was shared with premiers as one of the potential sources of authorities in this declaration.
Okay, I think your council can probably take it up with you because they have some time at the end. I have limited time, unfortunately. But would you agree with me that there was no discussion, for example, of how credit unions may be affected by the order or how insurers might be affected by the order? No acknowledgement that there are provincial crown corporations that provide motor vehicle insurance that could be affected by the order. Will you agree with me on those points?
Again, I don't remember the specifics of which financial institutions would or would not be affected, but I do know we shared with First Ministers the very clear option that should there be an invocation of the Emergencies Act, one of the authorities that we would purport to invoke would be a way to immobilize some of the very real financing, which was fueling, and no pun intended, because a lot of it was spent on fuel, I think, was fueling the illegal occupation in the city of Ottawa and some of the blockades at critical border infrastructures as examples.
I think I can probably help out a little bit. The document that Commission Council showed you was prepared by the Government of Canada. So I just want you to confirm that you have no...
Governor and Council made the decision. We consulted carefully and listened very carefully to what First Minister said at that meeting and in a series of previous discussions in the preceding weeks as well.
But just to be clear, at the First Minister's meeting, you don't recall if a detailed threat assessment was provided to the premiers?
Again, first of all, that would not have been a secure forum. A telephone conference call is not normally where senior intelligence officials would share detailed threat assessments. So that particular venue would not have been possible or appropriate. But the way that information was shared with provinces and territories is through the ongoing and secure communications between law enforcement officials of the Government of Canada. And those premiers, many of them would talk to us about it, were being updated by their own deputy ministers of public safety or deputy solicitors general in some provinces, or senior police leadership in their province that had the benefit of an open exchange in a secure context with the Canadian intelligence and law enforcement officials that were briefing the Government of Canada.
Minister, I have a couple of minutes left. I want to take you to a different issue, if I may. It's about your conversations with the Government of Quebec and the reservations expressed by Premier Legault and then your subsequent phone call with Minister Lebel. And if I understood you correctly, it was your position that the economic emergency measures that were taken had to apply nationally, correct?
Oui, moi j'ai offert.
Yes, I told Minister Lebel after the discussion with the premiers that for the economic measures to be effective, they had to be applied nationally. Because if somebody had a bank account, for instance, at the Caisse Populaire in Quebec or at the National Bank, that would not be actually out of reach from the measures that we would take.
Apply to the non-economic measures, does it?
Well, it does in the sense that they were preventative. We thought it was important, as I said to your colleague earlier, it wasn't clear that this problem was going to go away or that the people occupying the bridge in Windsor, Ontario weren't going to displace themselves somewhere else. There was an active discussion about risks to other critical infrastructure. So we thought that the national application of those measures, in the case it ultimately was necessary, would have given the local law enforcement authorities the tools, for example, that the City of Ottawa and the Ontario Provincial Police and the RCMP used so effectively to bring the occupation in Ottawa to a conclusion.
Mr. LeBlanc, let me end with this question then, but wouldn't it have been an alternative to have offered those non-economic measures to those provinces that wanted them and to enable them to opt in as they wished to? So those provinces who needed and wanted those powers could have gotten them right away, and those that maybe needed them later could have opted in if they needed them.
That wasn't considered as a responsible or realistic option because by enabling all of the local enforcement, law enforcement, and provincial police authorities to have recourse to those powers should they, in their judgment, determine they were necessary, was a more effective and comprehensive way to provide the deterrent effect to not have a particular group of illegal occupiers in one spot displace themselves somewhere else. So we didn't think we should be having governor and council processes every day following that decision. The more effective and responsible way was to enable protests.
Well, you'd agree that that ability to protest is one of the reasons it's protected in our charter is because it's important to that democratic process. It's the voice of, it's one of the ways that people can have a voice.
Absolutely. Lawful and peaceful protest is an essential part of any democracy. And as you said, it's protected constitutionally in Canada.
So you'd agree that the provinces then that were responding to these protests by lifting their restrictions would be an example of protesters being successfully heard, right?
No, I wouldn't speak for why provincial health authorities made those decisions. I have noted on a number of occasions that Premier Ford, in the case of Ontario, referred to following the medical advice from Dr. Moore, his chief public health officer, and other scientists. So no, I wouldn't purport to say, and I certainly don't purport to speak for premiers or their health ministers or their chief public health officers. They can explain why they made particular decisions with respect to their public health measures, but to say that it is in response to a protest, I think is a pretty simplistic analysis that may not be borne out by what a number of them have said publicly.
What they've said publicly, but if we look at Premier Ford's comments in this call, I grant you, he says he has the support of Dr. Moore, but he says that the public is at a breaking point, and so he's going to put in a more aggressive schedule in Ontario. You didn't take him to be referring to taking action in response to the protest?
No, because in that same conversation, he talked about his extreme frustration with the protests and the illegal blockades and the serious multi-billion-dollar damage it was doing to the economy of Ontario. He shared with me the conversations he had with the governor of Michigan He shared with me the conversations with union leaders, business leaders about the investment climate that this was sending for Ontario. He spoke to me about the very real risk of violence in Ottawa, the illegal occupation of Ottawa. He was not crediting the illegal occupation or blockades with his decision to adjust public health measures. And in fact, he referred to his chief public health officer in that context as well.
He wasn't crediting that decision, but it doesn't mean it wasn't motivating it, right?
Well, Premier Ford is quite an articulate political leader. I can't speak for why he made particular decisions within the sovereign jurisdiction of the government of Ontario. But my frequent conversations with him would lead me to believe that the decisions that he made on the appropriate public health measures, and Ontario was one of the jurisdictions in the country that had at various times amongst the most severe measures. So his government had taken.
Folks, if you want to be kept up to date on what's happening at the Emergency Act inquiry, including my live tweets and some clips and highlights that occurring at the Emergency Act inquiry, by heading over to revolutionnews.ca/Emergency Act Commission. That's revolutionnews.ca/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, here, folks, while you're there, please head over to donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. That's donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, here, folks, if you could chip in a buck or two, that will be greatly appreciated, as it will help me cover my travel expenses, including my expenses on food, as bringing you these stories doesn't come for free. Thank you so much.